I've fallen. I need help. Good afternoon, my fellow monks. I am the monkey sending sensei, and welcome back to my series Meditation with Vinyl. And on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about one of my personal favorite Beatles albums, and my personal favorite album of their early era. And that, of course, is the classic album from 1965, Help. By 1965, the Beatles were sort of at a turning point. They had released classic albums like Please Please Me, With the Beatles, one of my favorites, Hard Day's Night, and of course, the downtrodden, cover-laden, kind of confused, tired album, Beatles for Sale. This time in 1965, the Beatles had really gotten tired of Beatlemania and having to play shows and record, and that whole constant cycle was really getting to them. And in turn, they actually ended up meeting up with Bob Dylan, and he was a really big influence on the band during this period, and especially going forward. They started going into LSD and pot, and it was definitely a huge wave of creativity for them. And if you're familiar with my channel, you would have already known that I've covered albums such as Hard Day's Night and Let It Be on the channel before. So I've covered a little bit of both of the early era and the ending era of this band. Don't get it mistaken, Help is still a classic Beatles album through and through. You still have the mop top sound, pop rock, a little bit of folk country on here, but you can see things starting to turn. As songs like I'm a Loser and No Reply, back from Beatles for Sale, were to foreshadow, this album really hunkers down on the excellent songwriting. And to me, John Lennon is the star of this show. His writing is all over the place on this record, and I think he is the one that really shines brightest. Now, opening with the title track really showcases a lyrical maturity coming off of Hard Day's Night and Beatles for Sale. And John would actually go on to say that this song was the only one of two real Beatles songs that he ever wrote in the band. And of course, as many people know, John would become very much apprehensive and little icky towards the Beatles catalog as he broke up from the Beatles and became his own songwriter and his own mature artist in his own right. What an excellent opener this is. I would rank this up there with Back in the USSR and Hard Day's Night, and I Saw Her Standing There as this excellent album openers. They knocked it out of the park with this one. But of course, John isn't the only Beatle that shined on this record. But right after Help, you get the amazing deep cut The Night Before, which I really love from this album, and it's one of my favorite Paul McCartney tracks. Before I get too far in the album, of course, I can't forget about mentioning the movie Help, which I've actually never seen before. I might have saw it when I was a kid, but I don't remember too much of it, but it was actually the second movie that had come out from the Beatles, the first one being Hard Day's Night, all the way back in 1964. Same kind of deal. It was about the Beatles just going around doing silly things. It's actually known as the lesser of the two Beatles movies, if you don't count one that I might talk about later if I get to that album at some point. But Help is often seen as the lesser of the two Beatles movies. I would always recommend watching A Hard Day's Night first and then going to Help if you want to see two of the best Beatles movies. Not counting any kind of documentaries or anything like that. And I was talking about Bob Dylan earlier. We get the very first Beatles song to really have that Bob Dylan influence with the folky and emotional You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. This is one of my favorite songs on this record. It has a certain emotion and weight to it. You can definitely tell that the guys, specifically John at this stage, was really inspired by Bob Dylan and just soaking all that Americana in, because it's a very much Americana track. While the first two songs are kind of like their earlier sound a little bit with more mature lyrics, this is the first instance of folky Beatles that would continue on, specifically on Rubber Soul, that would come out 3 or 4 months later after this album. Moving on from Paul and John, we get one of my favorite George tracks on here, I Need You. This is really George's first main song. He did write a song with the Beatles called Don't Bother Me, and I love that track too, but to me, this song, I love how well produced it is. I love the lyrics. It's, again, very emotional, and I think George is really starting to come into his own a little bit, and you'll see as the Beatles progress, George is really becoming his own songwriter and is a force to be reckoned with by the end, alongside John and Paul. I Need You is not the only song where George shines on this album, because right after that, we get the amazing Another Girl, which Paul is on lead vocals, but George has these amazing backing vocals that really complement Paul's lead vocals. And this is a great track about Paul just finding a new girlfriend. And I can feel like the old girlfriend's kind of still bugging him a little bit. Like, no, I got a new girl, leave me alone. It kind of reminds me of Wayne's World a little bit, if you know that movie, where he falls in love with the rocker chick, but his old girlfriend kind of still wants to talk to him and go on dates and be with him. That's what this song reminds me of. But going from that song, going into You're Gonna Lose That Girl, it's almost like time has passed. Where now John is singing, if you don't treat this girl right, you're gonna lose her. If you don't, treat her the way she's meant to be treated. And I think that's a perfect way to sequence those two songs together. I couldn't see them flip-flopped. And I think it's a great way to really sequence this side of the record. Not done just yet. Before you flip the record over, we get the amazing, iconic, one of the most famous Beatles songs ever, Ticket to Ride. Now this song is just fantastic, and I love how it ends the first side of this record. But taking a ride, back to Ticket to Ride, this track is amazing. What a way to close out side 2. And one thing I have to mention is just the way this album is sequenced. Because you have to remember, back in the 60s, albums were sequenced like 2 EPs. So you'd have side A, side B, side 1, side 2. Or if you Guns N' Roses, you have side G, N, and R. But that's to get a little nitpicky on them. And even though this is prior to the Beatles really focusing on their albums as a whole entity, as a whole body of work, this album has the best track sequencing, I would say, since A Hard Day's Night. Where it's just every song is sequenced correctly, it flows perfectly. This was still at the height of Beatlemania, so they were still very low on studio time. They didn't really have the time to flesh out the songs, or the time to really experiment. They had to write the songs, record them, and that was it. They didn't get very many takes. They didn't really get that long to really put everything together. But that being said, I think this album and Hard Day's Night have the best track sequencing out of any Beatles record. Flipping over the record to side 2, we get one of my favorite Ringo tracks in Act Naturally. This is actually an old country western cover that they rejiggered and reworked, and it really fits Ringo's voice. I've always loved this song as a kid, hearing it through my dad's stereo. It just has a really cool sound to it. I love the twang and how Ringo's voice really suits it. And it's just a really cool song. And I just love the message of, hey, you can be an idiot, but you can still make it in life and just be lucky. And after Act Naturally, John slides back in with the excellent It's Only Love. Now this track, I've always loved as a kid as well. It just has this kind of happy-go-lucky vibe to it. But as I've gotten older, I kind of see the darker side of this song. Where he says, it's only love and that is all. Why should I feel the way I do? But then later on he says, but it's so hard loving you. So it's almost like you see the dynamic. He's showcasing the dynamic of, yeah, love is great, love's amazing, but also has a dark side of all the work and everything you have to put into a relationship. It's not just like magic poof, it's there. It's like, yeah, you have to work at it. Which is actually contradictory to what he would say later on when they wrote All You Need Is Love. Because in that he says, oh, love is easy. But on this song, it's kind of more realistic. We get my least favorite song on the record, You Like Me Too Much. It's a jaunty little George song. It's a good song. I wouldn't take it out of the record or anything, but to me, it's just the weak track on the record. It's a good song. The lyrics are kind of uppity, they're kind of happy, but then it's like, oh, if you leave me, I'm just going to come back to you anyway. It doesn't have as good optics as some of the other Beatles songs, but it's right up there with, say, Run For Your Life as kind of being a little bit collar tug, but it's still a good song nonetheless. I didn't want to delve too deep into it as it is my least favorite song on the record, but I didn't want to bring it up anyway. Honestly, I'm not too thrilled about Tell Me What You See either. I like the song, but it's probably the second weakest on here. I like it a little bit more than the last one, but to me, Tell Me What You See is more of just like, it's another Paul song to me. It's good, but it's not that great, so I'm going to kind of skip over that one too. But all my criticisms go out the window, because the last 3 tracks on this album are fantastic. I've Just Seen a Face, Yesterday, and Dizzy Miss Lizzie, all amazing tracks that close out this album in spectacular fashion. But going in order, the next song, I've Just Seen a Face, us Westerners wouldn't have heard until later on in 1965 when they released the American version of Rubber Soul. That track actually opens up that version of Rubber Soul. And hearing it on this album must have been a real shock to a lot of Westerners when they got the UK releases, because obviously the UK releases are more canon, what the Beatles wanted, and the US version, Capitol, they chopped off a lot of Beatles albums and kind of made their own records out of them, so it's like their own Beatles tree. So you had Beatles' first album, Beatles' second album, Beatles 65, albums like that, which were just kind of amalgamations of those Beatles records, of the UK release. This song is so great. Basically, it's a song about falling in love and just getting that very first, love bite. Or it's like, I've seen a face. I don't remember when I met this girl, but it's just so amazing. Like being in love. And I love the line where it's like, falling, and keeps calling me back again. And that acoustic, he's just jamming out on the acoustic. It's a very folky country type of song. I'm expecting Paul to be like, yeehaw, towards the middle of it, but such a great track. And this album really flexes its muscles in terms of the influence, too. There's a lot of country western, there's the folk, of course you still have the pop rock of the early days. It's a great blend. And I would actually recommend you start off with this record if you started off with the Beatles. If you had never heard a Beatles album before and you want to delve into the UK releases, I would actually say start with this because it's not psychedelic like their later stuff. It's not, as controversial as some of the ending albums. It's not as 50s sounding as the first couple records. This to me is the best record of that Beatles middle period, starting with this going up to Sgt. Pepper or Revolver kind of era. And I have no words. I mean, just look at the title of the song alone. I mean, it's one of the best songs ever written by anybody. One of my favorite songs ever. What can I say? It's just Paul, an acoustic guitar, and then some symphonic strings strewn out throughout the song. It's actually the first solo recording by any Beatle. It was just Paul and George Martin really hammering the track out in the studio. And it really paid off. Because going for something more melancholy like this, especially at a time when the Beatle mania was still in full swing, and everyone wanted the happy-go-lucky Beatles song, it was quite a risk for Paul and the Beatles to release this song, but boy did it pay off. It's such an excellent track. Many Beatles fans will say that this album should have ended with Yesterday and not have been the penultimate track. But I want to do a quick rebuttal to that. Because while I love Yesterday, and it would be an excellent closer to the record, we would be missing out on one of the best covers these guys would ever do. And that would be the excellent and just rockin' Dizzy Miss Lizzy. What can I say about this song? This is like Twist and Shout Part 2. John just yells his ass off on this track, and I love the lyrics. And again, there's another cover song, but it really harkens back to the early days of the Beatles and their more youthful fighting spirit before Beatlemania took over. This, to me, feels like I saw her standing there, twist and shout, like really early rockin' Beatles. And while I think Yesterday would be a great closer to this album, I think it'd be something missing if this album didn't end with Dizzy Miss Lizzy. Because after this, the Beatles would go on and do more experimental things. They would leave the 50s and that kind of early 60s style behind. They wouldn't do that anymore, unless you count One After 909 on Let It Be, but that would be till way later in their career. But this song is the last vestiges, the last trace of that early 50s, mid-50s sound that the Beatles were known for in their early days. After this, we get Rubber Soul, which is totally different. But this song is it's heavy. It's a great song about just loving someone and you want to marry him. It's like that rush of love. It's an amazing track. And I think it's a great way to end the album going full circle from their early days. If the early Beatles started with I Saw Her Standing There, the early Beatles ends just as hard and heavy and gracefully with Dizzy Miss Lizzy. I think this is one of the Beatles' best closes that they would ever do. And I love songs like Everybody Wants to Be My Baby and Twist and Shout. But this song just really encapsulates early Beatles and it really just takes the jar, puts the cap on it. That's early Beatles. And to me, Help is the cap of the early Beatles. Now, before I end the video, I want to go off and just mention the copy that I have is the 2012 vinyl reissue, which I've gone over this before. These reissues aren't well loved in the vinyl community because they are digitally sourced and they're not pure analog. The mono box set, which has all the albums that were made mono, basically from Please Please Me all the way up to the White Album. No Abbey Road, because that was never done in mono. But they are all from the original analog tapes. These stereo versions were not. But to me, these still sound great. And with the recent re-release and remix of Revolver that Giles Martin has just done, I have hope that they will remix this album and earlier Beatles albums in the future. I own the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper, I own Abbey Road, I have Let It Be. The only one I'm missing is the White Album, and I've had that before. And to me, Giles Martin is killing it with these mixes. If you've heard my review of Let It Be, then you already know how I feel about that album's remix. But every album that he has done, all the remixes are fantastic. And going into that very briefly, because I want to talk about that and do my Sgt. Pepper's review, but everything is just opened up. And so my hope is that in the future, Giles and Sam O'Kell will be able to use that demix technology that they used on Revolver and use it for albums like this, Hard Day's Night, and Rubber Soul. Because then us Beatles fans are really in for a treat. So there you guys go. This is my video on the Beatles' Help, one of my personal favorite albums of the early era. And to me, really showcases that early Beatles sound while maturing to the nth degree of what they could do with that sound. If you guys liked my opinion on this video, if you guys liked what I had to say, if you guys want to see me do more Beatles reviews, make sure to give me a like. Comment on the video. I want to hear you guys' feedback. Subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell for when I upload to the channel. I don't upload a lot, but when I do, I try to make it a special video. I try to make it something fun and entertaining for you guys with some knowledge thrown in there. Remember, listen to Rush. And never forget to keep meditating with vinyl.